I've spent my whole life loving my son. I've given up my dreams, worked myself to exhaustion, sacrificed every penny I could, all just to give him a better life. And then, one cold December morning, my only son drove me to a place I'd never been, and left me there. No real explanation, no hug, just a fake smile and the words, "Mom, you'll be all right." If you want to know what a 72-year-old mother did to reclaim everything that was taken from her, like this, comment the city you're viewing so I know how far my story has come, and don't go anywhere. I remember the exact moment I should have known. It was the way Brandon held the car door open for me. Too carefully, too politely, the way you hold a door open for someone you're trying not to upset before you do something terrible to them. He even smiled at me when I lowered myself into the passenger seat, and I remember thinking, he looks like his father when he smiles like that. I remember feeling something warm in my chest, something that I hadn't felt in months. I thought maybe we were finally turning a corner, that all the tension of the past year, the arguments about money, his new girlfriend Cassandra hovering at the edge of every conversation, the legal papers I never fully understood, maybe all of that was finally behind us. I was 72 years old and I wanted to believe my son still loved me. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about that morning. I wanted it so badly that I ignored every signal telling me otherwise. The drive took longer than I expected. I watched the familiar streets of the neighborhood where I'd lived for 31 years gradually give way to roads I barely recognized. Older roads, quieter ones, lined with bare winter trees and brown patches of grass that hadn't recovered from the first frost. I asked Brandon where we were going, and he said, "Somewhere you can rest, Mom. Somewhere they'll take care of you properly." And I heard the words "take care of you," and I felt that warmth again, fool that I was. I patted his hand on the gear shift, and I said, "Thank you, sweetheart." I actually said thank you. He didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on the road and adjusted his grip on the wheel, and I turned back to the window and watched the trees blur past, and I told myself everything was going to be fine.
But
The facility was called Meadow Pines Assisted Living Center, which was one of the least accurate names I had ever encountered in my life. There were no meadows. There were no pines. There was a cracked asphalt parking lot, a rusted metal sign on a brick wall that someone had tried to repaint at some point and given up halfway through, and a set of glass doors with a smear across the lower panel that looked like it had been there since the previous decade. Brandon pulled into the lot and put the car in park, and sat there for a moment before he said anything. "I've already handled the paperwork on my end," he said, not looking at me. "There's just a few things you'll need to sign." "Sign for what?" "Financial authorization, power of attorney stuff. Just routine, Mom. So they can bill insurance properly, and I can manage things for you while you're getting settled." I looked at him then, really looked at him. He had his father's jaw, but his father's jaw had always been set with a kind of quiet confidence, and what I saw in Brandon's jaw that morning was something tighter, something that looked more like held breath. "Brandon," I said slowly, "why do I need to give you power of attorney to check into an assisted living center?" He finally turned to look at me, and I saw it then, just for a second, just a flicker, something behind his eyes that wasn't quite right. And then it was gone, replaced by a practiced kind of patience that I recognized from when he was a teenager trying to talk me into something. "It's just how they structure the billing," he said. "Their system requires a family financial contact. Honestly, it's more of a formality. The lawyer already explained all of it." "What lawyer?" "The estate attorney I hired. I told you about this, Mom." He hadn't. He absolutely had not. But the way he said it, so calm, so certain, with just enough exasperation around the edges to make me feel like the confusion was mine, I found myself second-guessing my own memory. That was a thing that happened to me sometimes now, small lapses, moments where I couldn't quite trust the timeline of recent events. Brandon knew that. He had always known exactly which of my insecurities to press. "Come on," he said gently, opening his door. "Let's get you inside and get you warm. You can ask all the questions you want once we're in." The woman at the front desk was named Patrice, and she had the specific brand of cheerfulness that belongs to people who have learned that cheerfulness is a professional requirement rather than an emotional state. She called me sweetheart twice in the first 30 seconds, handed me a folder of laminated papers, and spoke to Brandon almost exclusively after the initial greeting, as though I had already become a logistical concern rather than a person. The room they showed me was on the second floor. It smelled like industrial cleaner over something older, something that no amount of cleaner was ever going to fully address. There was a single bed with a headboard the color of old mustard, a narrow window overlooking the parking lot, a small television mounted at a crooked angle on the wall, and a shared bathroom at the end of the hall. Patrice pointed out the call button beside the bed, the dining schedule pinned above the doorframe, and the visitor policy binder on the nightstand, all with the same bright professional smile. I stood in the center of the room and looked around it and tried to find one thing, just one thing, that suggested this was somewhere a person was meant to live rather than somewhere a person was meant to be stored. I couldn't find one. "It's temporary," Brandon said from the doorway, as though he'd read my silence. "Just until I get things sorted out with the house and the estate accounts. A few weeks, maybe a month." "The house?" I turned to look at him. "What's happening with the house?" "I'm just managing some financial restructuring. The attorney recommended liquidating a few assets to avoid estate tax complications." "It's all very standard, Mom. Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm doing something wrong." His voice dropped into something quieter, something with an edge underneath the softness. "I'm trying to help you. I've been trying to help you for years, and I'm exhausted, and I need you to just trust me for once." And there it was. For once. As though I had spent a lifetime being unreasonable. As though every act of care and sacrifice I had ever made for him was being quietly reframed as a burden I'd placed on his shoulders. I signed the papers. God help me, I signed every one of them. Did. He left 40 minutes later. He said he'd call that evening. He said he'd visit that weekend. He hugged me at the door to my room. A stiff, brief hug, the kind you give someone you've already moved past emotionally. And then he was gone. And I stood in that hallway, listening to his footsteps recede toward the elevator. And I felt something I had not felt since the morning they told me my husband was dead. I felt completely alone. The evening came and went, no call. The weekend passed, no visit. I used the phone in the common room to call his cell 4 times over the following 6 days. 3 of the calls went straight to voicemail. The 4th rang through, and Brandon picked up, and I could hear Cassandra's voice somewhere behind him, laughing at something. And he said, "Mom, I can't talk right now. Everything is fine. I'll come by soon," and hung up before I could say anything else. I set the receiver down very carefully, and I looked at the wall in front of me. A bulletin board covered in activity schedules and photocopied notices, and a handwritten sign that said, "Smile. Today is a gift." And I made a decision so quietly it barely registered as a decision at all. I was not going to cry. I was going to figure out exactly what he had done. The first thing I understood about Meadow Pines was that it operated on the assumption that its residents would not be paying close attention. The staff were not unkind, for the most part, but they were stretched thin and overworked and underpaid, and the result was a place where things simply went unaddressed, unanswered call buttons, medications delivered at inconsistent hours, meals that arrived cold and were collected cold without anyone asking why a resident hadn't eaten. I watched all of this in my first week, cataloging it the way I used to catalog discrepancies in quarterly reports back when I ran Hartwell Home Goods out of a converted warehouse on the east side of the city. People had a habit of underestimating me then, too. You have gray hair and a pleasant face, and you're on the shorter side, and people make certain assumptions. Those assumptions had always been my greatest professional advantage, and I saw no reason why they couldn't serve me here. What Brandon had never fully grasped about his mother, what he had always, to his own detriment, dismissed as mere housekeeping instinct, was that I had spent 22 years building and running a business that turned a $50,000 inheritance into a company worth significantly more. I had negotiated with vendors who tried to rob me blind. I had navigated a lawsuit that should have destroyed the company and walked away having restructured our entire asset base instead. I had kept books so precise and paper trails so thorough that my accountant once told me I was either the most organized person he'd ever worked with or the most paranoid. He meant it as a compliment. Brandon had benefited from that company his entire life. He'd gone to college on it. He'd gotten his first apartment funded partly through it. when his own business venture collapsed 6 years ago. I had quietly absorbed $60,000 of his debt without telling a soul. I'd done it because he was my son, and because I loved him, and because his father wasn't alive to help him, and so that responsibility had fallen to me, and he had taken all of that love and all of that history and used it as a blueprint. He had watched me my entire adult life and learned exactly what I had and exactly how to take it. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 11 days after Brandon left me at Meadow Pines, that I found the first real crack in the wall. I had asked Patrice, very pleasantly, very casually, the way I used to ask vendors to clarify line items I already knew were wrong, whether I could get a copy of my admission paperwork for my personal records. She looked slightly uncomfortable and said she'd have to check with administration. I thanked her warmly and went back to my room and sat on the edge of the mustard-colored bed and waited. She never brought the paperwork. That told me something. 3 days later, I asked one of the newer aides, a young woman named Dara, who had the slightly shell-shocked look of someone who had recently discovered that the job was not what the listing described, if she knew whether family members could access a resident's financial authorization documents. Dara didn't know, but she mentioned offhandedly that most of the resident's financial paperwork went through an outside management company rather than being held on site. I asked her the name of the company. She looked it up for me on her phone without thinking twice about it, because I had spent 9 days learning exactly how to ask Dara things in a way that seemed harmless. The company was called Pinnacle Estate Management, LLC. I had never heard of it, but the name was familiar in a specific, uncomfortable way, the way something is familiar when you've heard it mentioned in a context you should have paid more attention to. I turned it over in my mind for the rest of that afternoon, and by evening I remembered. Cassandra. Cassandra had mentioned something about an estate management consultancy once, the previous summer, at a family dinner where Brandon had drunk too much wine and laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny. She'd said her cousin ran a firm. She'd said it was very useful for families managing complex inheritances. I had smiled politely and changed the subject. I did not smile now. Yetek. By the end of my second week at Meadow Pines, I had begun to understand the shape of what had been done to me, even if I didn't yet have the full dimensions of it. The papers I had signed in that parking lot, the ones Brandon had described as routine billing authorization, were not routine billing authorization. I was almost certain of that now. Power of attorney, if structured the way I suspected it had been, would give Brandon authority not just to manage my medical billing, but potentially to act on my behalf in financial and legal matters as well. Combined with whatever the estate attorney had drawn up, an attorney I had never met, never spoken with, never selected, that was a blueprint for complete financial takeover. The house, the investment accounts, the trust I had established during my years running Hartwell Home Goods. I lay in the dark on that narrow bed, and I ran the numbers in my head the way I always had during hard times, laying out what I knew against what I didn't know, trying to find the fulcrum point. There was one thing that kept coming back to me. One thing that Brandon had never known about, not fully, because I had structured it deliberately and quietly and without ever explaining it to anyone. 5 years before my husband died, when he and I were still planning for the long version of our future, I had worked with a different attorney, not the estate lawyer in our usual firm, but an independent fiduciary I had found through a business contact, to establish what was called a protected charitable trust. The trust held a significant portion of the assets from the Hartwell Home Goods sale. It was registered under a slightly different version of my name for administrative purposes, and it contained a specific clause drafted at my insistence that required my direct, in-person, witnessed authorization for any modification to the beneficiary's structure or asset disposition. I had forgotten about it in the way you forget about a life raft stored in a cupboard when the seas are calm, but I had not forgotten about it entirely. And I still had, tucked inside a small leather folio in the bottom of my overnight bag, the one bag I had packed myself before Brandon came to collect me, the one bag he had not bothered to inspect, a copy of that trust document. I didn't take it out that night. I just pressed my hand against the side of the bag in the dark and felt the hard edge of the folio through the fabric, and I took the first deep breath I had taken in 2 weeks. He doesn't know, I thought. He missed it. He took everything he could find, and he missed it. And right behind that thought came something that surprised me with its clarity and its coldness. Good. There was a man on my floor named Walter Okafor, and he had been at Meadow Pines for 7 months, and he was the sharpest person in any room he entered, a fact that the staff had largely missed, possibly because Walter moved slowly due to his hip and spoke softly due to years of professional habit, and people mistook both of those things for diminishment. Walter had been a forensic accountant. He had retired at 68, gone into an Airstream with his wife to travel the country, lost her to a stroke in New Mexico 2 years later, and ended up at Meadow Pines after his daughter convinced him he needed a supportive community during his grief. He suspected now that his daughter had also been consulting with someone about his assets, though he hadn't yet confirmed the specifics. He told me all of this over dinner on my 14th day at the facility, when he sat down across from me uninvited with a tray of gray mashed potatoes and a cup of coffee that he set aside immediately and said, "That's not coffee," with the finality of a man who had given up expecting it to be. I told him some of what I suspected. Not everything, not the trust, not the folio, not the specific numbers, but enough. Walter listened without interrupting, which was the first thing I respected about him. Then he said, "The management company is the key. Everything else is just the surface of it. If they've routed your assets through an LLC, they're counting on the complexity to buy themselves time." Time for what? Time for the paper trail to get long enough that unwinding it becomes expensive and discouraging. He picked up the coffee, considered it, put it back down. "How much documentation do you have?" "Enough," I said. "Potentially more than enough." He looked at me for a moment, recalibrating whatever initial impression he'd formed. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question." "Run a company for 22 years, I said. "You get a sense for when the books don't add up." Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a woman who comes in on Thursdays. She's some kind of legal advocate, works for a nonprofit that handles elder financial abuse cases. She's been talking to a few of us." He paused. "I think you should talk to her." I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I think I should." That night I took this folio out of my bag and sat with it in my lap for a long time. I read through the trust document, all 34 pages of it, in the dim light from the parking lot coming through my narrow window, because I didn't want to turn on the overhead light and have it be visible under the door. What I found confirmed everything I needed. The asset protection clause was intact. The in-person witnessing requirement was explicit and unambiguous. And attached to the back of the document, in a small plastic sleeve, was a business card I had placed there years ago and never removed. The card of the independent fiduciary who had drafted it, a woman named Iris Conley, who, if she was still practicing, was still the only person other than me who held a complete record of the trust's existence. I turned the card over in my fingers. The phone number had a local area code. Brandon had walked into my life's work thinking it was a locked room. He hadn't noticed the second door. What I want to tell you about grief, real grief, the kind that comes from betrayal by someone you built your entire sense of family around, that it doesn't feel the way people describe it. It isn't a wave. It isn't a storm. It's quieter than that, and in some ways much more dangerous, because it settles into you like weight. You wake up in the morning, and the weight is the first thing you feel, before you've even fully remembered why, and then you remember why, and you have to decide whether to get up anyway. I got up anyway. Every morning, I got up and I made my bed, and I washed my face, and I went down to breakfast, and I smiled at the aides, and I ate what they put in front of me, and I watched everything around me with complete attention, because that is what my mother had taught me, long before any business lesson or legal clause or financial strategy. "You survive by watching," she used to say, "and you win by watching better than the people who think they've already won." I was 72 years old. I had outlasted a market crash, a lawsuit, a recession, and the death of the man I had loved for 40 years. My son thought he had put me somewhere I couldn't do any damage. He had made the same mistake that people had been making about me my entire life. He had looked at me and seen only what was easiest to see. He hadn't looked hard enough. And before this was over, before any of this was over, that was going to cost him everything. Thursday came with a thin drizzle that turned the parking lot outside my window into a gray mirror, and I sat in the common room with a cup of tea I wasn't drinking and waited. Her name was Noelle Vasquez, and she arrived at 10 past 9 carrying a canvas tote bag that was overstuffed to the point of structural failure, and a coffee in a paper cup that she'd already half finished. She was maybe 34, 35, with dark hair pulled back in the kind of bun that starts the day neat and loses the argument by noon. She wore flat shoes and a blazer that had seen better days, and she walked through the doors of Meadow Pines with the specific energy of someone who knew exactly what kind of place they were walking into and had already made their peace with being angry about it. Walter had described her well. I watched her check in at the front desk, exchange a clipped professional greeting with Patrice, and then scan the common room in the way people do when they're looking for someone without wanting to appear to be looking. Her eyes passed over me, then came back. I gave her the smallest possible nod. She sat down across from me with her overstuffed bag and her half-finished coffee, and she said without preamble, "Walter says you ran a company." "For 22 years," I said, "Hartwell Home Goods, distribution and retail. And you think your son has taken control of your assets through a power of attorney you signed under false pretenses?" "I don't think it," I said. "I'm quite certain of it." She studied me for a moment. "Most people I talk to in here are certain of a lot of things and can document very little, no offense." "None taken," I said. "I can document quite a lot." Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatic, just a small recalibration, the way a professional recalibrates when a situation turns out to be different from the standard version. She reached into the canvas bag and pulled out a legal pad and a pen that was already uncapped. "Tell me," she said. So I told her. "Not everything, not yet. I had learned long ago that you don't put all your evidence on the table in the first meeting. You put enough to establish that you have evidence, and you watch how the other person responds to it." I told her about the papers Brandon had brought to the facility, about Pinnacle Estate Management LLC, about the connection to Cassandra's cousin. I told her about the house and the accounts and the phone calls that went unanswered. I told her about Walter's suspicions regarding his own daughter. I did not tell her about the trust. Not yet. Noelle wrote steadily the whole time I spoke. When I finished, she looked up and said, "The LLC is the piece I want to pull on first. If they've routed your assets through a management company, there will be a filing trail. That's public record." She paused. "Do you know what attorney drew up the power of attorney documents?" Brandon referred to him as an estate attorney. He never gave me a name. "Do you still have the papers you signed?" "No, but I signed them in that parking lot, which means they were executed outside this facility and outside any standard intake procedure. If Meadow Pines processed them without independent verification that I signed voluntarily and with full understanding, they may have exposure too." Noelle's pen stopped moving. She looked at me over the top of her legal pad with an expression that I would have found flattering if I'd been in the mood for flattery. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "I've had very little else to occupy my time," I said. "The activity schedule here is not exactly demanding." What Noelle explained to me over the next hour, quietly, in the corner of the common room, while a television in the background played a game show nobody was watching, was that what had apparently been done to me was not uncommon, and that its lack of novelty was both reassuring and infuriating. There was a term for it: elder financial exploitation. It happened in patterns, she said, and Brandon's pattern was one she had seen variations of before. A family member, often a child, leverages an aging parent's trust and cognitive anxiety to obtain legal authority over their finances, then uses that authority to redirect assets before the parent understands what has happened. The window they're counting on, she said, is confusion. If the victim doesn't understand what was signed or doesn't have the resources to mount a legal challenge quickly, the assets get moved, restructured, and in some cases spent before anyone can act. "Brandon isn't stupid," I said. "He knew I'd figure it out eventually." "Most of them count on eventually being too late," she said. I looked at her steadily. "Then we need to make sure it isn't." She nodded, making another note. "I'll need to file a formal complaint with the Adult Protective Services Financial Crimes Unit. That starts a clock. Once the complaint is on record, any financial institution processing transactions on your accounts will receive notification that the authorization is under dispute." She paused. "That alone may freeze some of the movement." "How long does that take?" "Filing? I can do it today. The investigation opening, a few days to a week. A few days to a week felt like a very long time. But it was the first concrete piece of forward motion I'd had since the moment Brandon drove away from this parking lot, and I held on to it. After she left, I went back to my room and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I let myself feel, for exactly 10 minutes, everything I had been carefully not feeling for the past 2.5 weeks. The humiliation of it. The specific grief of realizing that the person who had hurt you most was someone you had once held in your arms when they were small enough to hold. The anger, not hot, not explosive, but deep and steady and cold, like a river in January that looks still on the surface and is moving very fast underneath. 10 minutes. Then I stopped. I washed my face with cold water, and I looked at myself in the mirror above the narrow sink, at the woman looking back at me, 72 years old with steel gray hair and lines around her eyes that I had earned every single one of. And I said out loud to nobody but myself, "You have been underestimated by more capable men than your son." Then I went to find Walter. Walter Okafor in professional mode was a different entity from Walter Okafor over dinner, and I mean that as a high compliment. The slowness was still there. He needed a moment to settle into his chair and another moment to arrange the notepad and the reading glasses he'd retrieved from his room. But once he was settled, the mind that had spent decades finding the places where numbers lied became completely present. Pinnacle Estate Management LLC, he said, turning the name over like he was checking it for weight. Have you found a registration date? Not yet. I don't have internet access here except the shared terminal in the activity room, and I haven't wanted to use it where someone might see the search. Smart. He made a note on his pad. The formation date matters. If they incorporated recently, within the last year, say, that suggests this was set up specifically for this purpose, rather than being an existing operation that was brought in. Bespoke fraud leaves different tracks than opportunistic fraud. Bespoke fraud, I repeated. It means someone planned this carefully, planned it for you, specifically. He said it without any particular inflection, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. Which also means there will be a lawyer involved somewhere, because you can't pull off structured asset redirection without legal instruments, and legal instruments leave records. Noel mentioned filing with Adult Protective Services. That's the right first move. But the civil track matters just as much as the criminal one. A PS can freeze movement and open an investigation, but they can't get your money back. That's going to require a civil action to unwind the power of attorney and challenge whatever property transfers have already been executed. He looked at me over his glasses. Do you have independent legal representation? Not yet. You need one. Not Noel's organization. They do good work, but they're advocates, not litigators. You need someone who does elder financial abuse litigation specifically. He paused. I know someone. She's in private practice now. She used to work the fraud division before she went private, and she does plaintiff-side elder cases on partial contingency when the asset value justifies it. He said the name. I wrote it down. Then he said more quietly, Evelyn, how much are we talking about? I had been waiting for this question, and I had been deciding, since he'd first sat down across from me 11 days ago, how I was going to answer it when it came. Walter Okafor was a man I had known for less than 3 weeks. He had given me no reason to distrust him, but I had also built a company on the principle that the fewer people who knew the full shape of your assets, the fewer vectors existed for those assets to be attacked. Enough, I said, that it's worth fighting hard for. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once. That was the thing about Walter. He understood discretion from the inside. He didn't push. Then fight hard, he said. What I didn't tell Noel, and what I didn't tell Walter, and what I had told nobody in that building, was what I knew about the inside of Meadow Pines itself. Because here is the thing about being deposited in a place and ignored. You have time. You have an enormous amount of time. And if you happen to be someone who spent decades watching how systems work and where they fail, you begin to notice things. I noticed that the medication cart was routinely 40 minutes late to the East Wing, which mattered because 2 residents in the East Wing had time-sensitive cardiac prescriptions. I noticed that the call log, the record of when residents pressed the bedside assistance button and when a staff member responded, was kept on a clipboard at the nurse's station, and was updated by hand in a way that would be almost impossible to verify against actual response times. I noticed that one of the overnight aides, a man named Terrence, spent large portions of his shift in the break room while residents who needed repositioning went without for hours. I noticed that 3 residents, all of them without regular family visitors, had been moved to smaller rooms in the past 2 months with no explanation given in their resident files, rooms that happened to be less expensive and whose billing, as far as I could determine, had not been adjusted to reflect the change in accommodation. That last one I found out through a conversation with a woman named June Alderman, who had been at Meadow Pines for 11 months and who had the resigned clarity of someone who had accepted her circumstances so completely that she no longer expected them to be otherwise. June was 78, a retired school teacher, and she had been moved from a corner room with 2 windows to a room with 1 window facing a wall, and nobody had explained it to her, and when her nephew had called to ask about it, he'd been told the move had been at her request. "I never requested it," she told me, in the flat voice of someone who had already exhausted her disbelief. "But Gerald doesn't know me well enough to know I wouldn't have. He took their word for it." "Did you sign anything before the move?" "A form. They said it was a room preference update." I looked at her. "Do you still have a copy?" "I doubt it." "June," I said carefully, "would you be willing to talk to someone? A legal advocate specifically, someone who looks into situations like this." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then she said, "I spent 31 years teaching other people's children to stand up when something was wrong." She paused. "I suppose I should try it myself." What was building inside Meadow Pines, quietly, without announcement, was something that the facility's administration would not have recognized as dangerous, because it didn't look dangerous. It looked like an old woman making conversation over dinner. It looked like 2 residents sharing a table in the common room with a cup of tea. It looked like the most ordinary, ignorable thing in the world. That was, of course, the point. By the end of my 3rd week, I had spoken meaningfully with 6 residents. 4 of them had agreed to talk to Noelle. 2 of those 4 had specific documented grievances. June with the room reassignment, and a man named Harold Stitch, who had discovered that a family member listed as his financial contact had been authorizing withdrawals from his personal account without his knowledge. Harold was 81 and walked with 2 canes and had a voice like gravel and absolutely no interest in being victimized quietly. "I spent 40 years in labor organizing," he told me when I sat down next to him one afternoon in the courtyard. "You think I don't know what it looks like when someone's management is stealing from the workers?" "I think you know exactly what it looks like," I said. He looked at me with sharp, pale eyes. "What are you actually building here?" I considered how to answer that. "A case," I said. "For myself first. But if the circumstances here are what I think they are, it may become something larger." Harold was quiet for a moment. A sparrow landed on the edge of the courtyard wall and regarded us briefly and flew away. "My daughter is an investigative journalist," Harold said. "She's been looking for a story about elder care facility mismanagement for 8 months. Can't find one willing to go on record." He said it casually. He looked at the sparrow leaving. I felt the cold, quiet river inside me pick up speed. "Tell her," I said, "that she may have found one." Tonk. Meanwhile, in the outside world, things were happening that I was learning about in pieces, through Noelle, and through a brief conversation I managed to have on a Thursday afternoon when she let me use her cell phone to call Iris Conley. Iris Conley had not retired. She was 70 herself and still practicing, and she remembered the trust document the way you remember something you built with particular care, which is to say she remembered every clause and every reason for every clause in the name of the notary, and the specific concern I had raised when we were drafting the witnessing requirement. "Someone is trying to access it," she said when I'd finished explaining. "I believe they've already tried and found they can't," I said. "I think they don't know it exists, but I need to know the trust is secure." "It's secure," she said. "Nothing has been filed against it. I'd have been notified." A pause. "Evelyn, what has happened?" I told her in broad outline. There was a silence on the line that I recognized as the silence of someone absorbing something that makes them angry, slowly, on behalf of someone else. I want you to give Noel Vasquez my direct number, Iris said finally. And I want you to reach out to the civil litigator she recommends because you're going to need one. But I want you to know something. Her voice was steady and particular. That trust was written to protect you, specifically for a situation where you could not protect yourself. It is going to do its job. I held the phone for a moment after she said that. I didn't say anything. Evelyn, she said, are you all right? Yes, I said. And then, because it was only the two of us, and she had known me for 20 years and had earned the honesty, no, not entirely, but I'm getting there. It was Brandon who called finally on a Wednesday evening in my 4th week at Meadow Pines, 26 days after he'd driven away from the parking lot. I was in the common room when Patrice came to find me, looking faintly uncomfortable in the way she looked whenever something fell outside her established procedures. She said I had a call at the front desk. I followed her and I picked up the receiver and I heard my son's voice. Mom, he said, how are you doing? There was a version of me, the mother I had been for most of his life, who would have answered that question honestly, who would have told him how the nights were long and the food was bad, and that she missed her own bed and her own kitchen and the sound of the neighborhood she had lived in for 30 years. There was a version of me who still, God help her, wanted to believe there was an explanation that made all of this less than what it was. That version of me was still there. She's always still there. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. But she wasn't the one who answered the phone. I'm fine, Brandon, I said. My voice was even, completely even. How are you? A beat. He'd expected something different, I think. Tears, maybe, or anger, or the exhausted pleading of someone who has been waiting too long for a call that was too slow in coming. I'm good, he said. I've been handling some things with the attorney. It's taking longer than expected. What specifically is taking longer? I asked. Another beat. Longer this time. The asset restructuring, he said carefully. There were some complications. What kind of complications? Mom. His voice shifted into the patient, slightly patronizing register I had come to recognize as the register he used when he wanted me to stop asking questions. I'm handling it. You don't need to worry about the details. I want to worry about the details, I said. They're my assets. Silence. I have power of attorney, he said finally. Yes, I said. You do. And I said nothing else. I let the silence stretch out between us on that phone line, let him fill it with whatever he needed to fill it with, and I stood at the front desk of Meadow Pines with the receiver in my hand, and I listened to my son breathe, and I thought about a trust document in a leather folio in the bottom of my overnight bag, and about a forensic accountant with a legal pad and a sharp mind, and about a journalist who had been looking for a story for 8 months, and about 6 residents who were tired of being invisible. I'll call again soon, Brandon said, eventually. I'll be here, I said. We hung up. I stood at the desk for a moment, and Patrice glanced at me sideways, and I straightened my shoulders and turned toward the hallway, and I walked back toward my room with the specific, quiet purposefulness of someone who knows exactly what they're walking toward, even if nobody else in the building does. Behind me, the common room television murmured its game show questions into the empty air. In my room, the leather folio sat in the bottom of my bag. And somewhere across the city, in an office I'd never visited, Pinnacle Estate Management LLC was about to discover that the woman they'd written off as powerless had been anything but. The civil litigator's name was Sandra Keel, and the first thing she said to me, after Noel had arranged a private meeting in a small conference room at the nonprofit's office, the first time I had left Meadow Pines in 31 days, was that she needed me to understand something before we went any further. I take these cases because they matter, she said, setting a legal pad on the table between us with the deliberate precision of someone who has learned to arrange a workspace as a form of mental preparation. Not because they're easy. Elder financial exploitation litigation is slow, expensive for the other side, and emotionally brutal for my clients. I need to know you can sustain that. She was in her mid-50s, Sandra Keel, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the direct gaze of someone who had spent enough years in courtrooms to have stopped softening her questions for comfort. I looked back at her with the same directness and said, I ran a business for 22 years. I survived a lawsuit that should have destroyed it, a recession that took out 3 of my competitors, and the death of my husband of 40 years. I have been systematically robbed by my only child and left in a facility where the call buttons go unanswered and the medication cart runs 40 minutes late. I can sustain it. Sandra Keel looked at me for a moment. Then she uncapped her pen. Tell me about the trust, she said. I told her everything, all of it, this time. The full formation history, the asset value, the witnessing clause, Iris Connolly's contact information, the leather folio in the bottom of my overnight bag. I told her about Pinnacle Estate Management, LLC, and the connection to Cassandra's family. I told her what Walter had assessed about the paper trail, and what Noelle had filed with Adult Protective Services, and what Iris had confirmed about the trust's untouched status. She wrote steadily through all of it, and when I finished, she sat back and looked at what she'd written and said, The trust is your strongest piece. If Brandon attempted to access it and couldn't, that means he may not know it exists, which means he built his entire scheme on an incomplete picture of your assets. She tapped the pen against the pad. That's a significant structural flaw in what he's done. I know, I said. The POA documents are challengeable on multiple grounds. The circumstances under which you signed, the lack of independent legal counsel, potentially the language itself depending on how they were drafted. She paused. I'm going to need the name of the attorney who drew them up. Every attorney has a bar number and a filing history, and if this person has done this before, there will be a pattern. Brandon never gave me the name. He didn't need to. The documents will have been filed somewhere. We'll find him. She closed the legal pad. Mrs. Hartwell, I want to be honest with you. What you've described, the LLC, the structured asset redirection, the placement in a facility as a mechanism of isolation, this isn't an impulsive crime. Someone helped your son plan this. Someone with legal knowledge and enough sophistication to know which instruments to use. I had thought about this. I had thought about it in the dark, lying on the narrow bed in my room at Meadow Pines, going over every conversation I could remember from the past 2 years, looking for the seam where the plan had started. Cassandra, I said, or someone connected to her. We'll find the thread, Sandra said, and when we pull it, I want you to be prepared for what unravels. What unraveled over the following 2 weeks was worse than I had expected, and I had expected it to be bad. Walter, working through contacts he'd maintained from his forensic accounting career, obtained the public registration documents for Pinnacle Estate Management, LLC. It had been incorporated 14 months earlier, not recently enough to look like pure opportunism, but not long established enough to be a legitimate operation with a real client base. The registered agent was a law firm I didn't recognize. The listed manager was a name I didn't recognize either, but Noelle ran it and came back to me 3 days later with the look of someone who has found exactly the thing they were afraid of finding. The manager of Pinnacle is a man named Derek Folau, she said, sitting across from me in the common room with her overstuffed bag and her ever-present coffee. He's Cassandra's cousin. I let out a slow breath. So it was always her. Her, or at minimum her family's operation with her participation. Derek Folau has a history. He was involved in 2 prior complaints filed with APS in different counties. Neither one resulted in prosecution because the complainants either couldn't document their cases sufficiently or were convinced by family members to drop it. She looked at her notes. But the complaints exist, they're on record, and Sandra can use them to establish a pattern. I sat with that for a moment. 14 months. They had started building this 14 months ago, while I was still going to Sunday dinners at Brandon's house, while Cassandra was still handing me a glass of wine and asking politely about my health, while I was still believing, still, that the tension between us was ordinary family friction, the kind that resolves itself eventually if you're patient enough. 14 months of planning, against a 71-year-old widow who had done nothing to anyone except love her son more than was wise. What else? I asked, because there was more. I could see it in the way Noelle was holding her coffee. The house, she said. Sandra's team pulled the property records. A quitclaim deed was filed 6 weeks ago transferring the property out of your name. The kitchen where I had cooked 30 years of meals. The garden my husband had put in the year before he got sick. The one I'd kept going because I couldn't bring myself to let it go. The bedroom where I had slept for 3 decades. Into whose name? I asked. A holding company. Different name, but the registered address traces back to the same law firm as Pinnacle. I looked at the wall across from me. Someone had put up a poster of a mountain landscape with an inspirational quote printed across the bottom in white letters. I had looked at that poster every day for 5 weeks and never actually read the quote, and I didn't read it now. They moved fast, I said. They did, Noelle said quietly. But Evelyn, the trust. The house can be unwound if we can establish the deed was executed under fraudulent authority. The trust they can't touch at all. Whatever they've moved, whatever they've restructured, the trust is intact, and it is yours. I nodded. I kept nodding for a moment longer than I needed to, because it was either nod or do something less composed, and I had not come this far to be less composed. Harold Stitch's daughter was named Renata, and she arrived at Meadow Pines on a Tuesday afternoon with a journalist's recorder and the quiet, observant energy of someone who has trained herself to walk into rooms without disturbing them. She was in her mid-40s, with Harold's pale eyes and a directness of manner that made it clear where she'd inherited it from. She and I talked for 2 hours in the courtyard, because the courtyard had no staff presence to speak of, and the ambient noise of the street beyond the wall provided enough cover for a private conversation. I had asked Noelle whether I should be speaking to a journalist at this stage, and Noelle had thought about it and said it depended on what kind of journalist, what kind of story, and whether the timing worked in our favor rather than against it. Public pressure doesn't always help legal cases, she'd said, but it can accelerate the institutional response. If Meadow Pines is operating with the kind of systemic neglect you're describing, a documented story about the facility's practices gives regulators additional motivation to act quickly. What if Brandon finds out I've been talking to people? He probably already suspects you're not sitting quietly. The question is whether what you're building moves faster than his response to it. So I talked to Renata Stitch. I told her about the medication delays and the unanswered call buttons and the room reassignments and the fraudulent form June had signed. I told her about the pattern of financially vulnerable residents being placed in facilities through family members who then maintain control of their finances. I told her what I knew about Pinnacle Estate Management. Renata listened and asked clean, precise questions, the kind that were designed to test the edges of what you actually knew versus what you assumed. I respected that. I gave her what I had documentation for, and I was explicit when something was inference rather than established fact. Toward the end, she said, I need to ask you something directly. Are you doing this because of what happened to you, or are you doing this because of what's happening to the other residents here? I thought about it. Honestly thought about it, because she deserved an honest answer and because I'd been asking myself the same question in the quiet hours. Both, I said, and I don't think those two things are in conflict. What was done to me is also being done to other people in this building and probably in other buildings like it. The mechanism is the same. It relies on the assumption that elderly people are too confused, too isolated, or too resigned to fight back. I looked at her steadily. I am none of those things, and neither is your father. And neither is June Alderman, who taught school for 31 years and deserves a great deal better than what she's getting. Renata looked at me for a moment with something in her expression that wasn't quite sentiment, but was adjacent to it. Off the record, she said, I've been working on this story for 8 months. I had the shape of it, but not the center. The center needs a person. She paused. Would you be willing to be on record? I didn't hesitate. Yes. The APS investigation opened formally on a Thursday, 38 days after Noelle had filed the initial complaint. An investigator named Detective Pauline Marsh, Financial Crimes Division, brisk and methodical, with the air of someone who had heard every version of this story and was not surprised by any of them, but had not yet become cynical about it, came to Meadow Pines and sat with me in the same corner of the common room where Noelle and I had first talked. She had a folder. It was thick. Mrs. Hartwell, she said, I want to walk you through what we've established so far. And what she walked me through was this. The power of attorney Brandon had filed was real and legally executed, which meant challenging it required proving fraud in the inducement, that I had signed under false pretenses without full understanding, possibly under undue influence. The property transfer, my house, had been executed using that POA. The accounts Brandon had drained had been accessed the same way. The difference, she explained, between a civil challenge and a criminal investigation was that the criminal track required establishing intent, which meant establishing that Brandon had planned the deception rather than genuinely believed he was acting in my interest. The LLC connection is what gets us intent, she said. If we can show that Pinnacle Estate Management was established specifically to receive and hold your assets, and that your son had a prior relationship with the principals, particularly if we can show it predates his conversation with you about assisted living, that's evidence of premeditation. It was incorporated 14 months ago, I said. She looked up from the folder. How do you know that? I have a former forensic accountant helping me. She wrote something down. I'm going to need to speak with him. I'll arrange it, I said. She closed the folder and looked at me with the specific professional clarity of someone about to say something that is both necessary and difficult. I want to prepare you for something. When this becomes formal, when your son is informed that he's under investigation, his likely response is to move quickly, to attempt to restructure things further, to complicate the paper trail, to establish alternative explanations. She paused. How confident are you in your documentation? Very, I said. And is there anything you haven't told me yet that I should know? I looked at her. I had trusted Noelle because she was an advocate. I had trusted Walter because he had the same thing to lose that I did. I had trusted Sandra because she was my legal representation, and I had no choice. Pauline Marsh was law enforcement, which put her in a different category. Not untrustworthy, but subject to processes I didn't fully control. But she was also the person who could stop Brandon from moving what was left. There is one piece of documentation, I said carefully, that I have kept private until now. A trust document. It protects a significant portion of my assets, and it cannot be altered without my direct authorization. I watched her face. Brandon doesn't know it exists. If he finds out about it through this investigation before we're ready, he may attempt to access it and fail publicly, which could alert him to the full scope of what's coming. Pauline Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are you asking me to sequence the disclosure of that document within the investigation? I'm asking whether it's possible to do that, I said, and I'm asking whether doing it would compromise anything. She thought about it longer than I expected her to. Give me the name of the fiduciary who holds the trust, she said finally. I'll coordinate with your attorney on timing. I gave her Iris Conley's name. One more thing, she said, standing. Your son is going to figure out that something is moving. Probably sooner rather than later. I want you to keep our conversations confidential. I want you to continue to take his calls normally, and I want you to tell me immediately if he asks you anything specific about your financial history or any documents you may have kept. You want me to be a source, I said. I want you to be careful, she said. There's a difference. Sure. He called again that Friday, 8 days after the first call. This time his voice had a different quality to it. Still careful, still controlled, but with something underneath the control that hadn't been there before. A thinness, like a surface that was holding but starting to show the stress fractures. Mom, he said, I need to ask you something. Of course, I said. My voice was warm and mild and completely steady. When you left the house, when you packed your bag before I came to pick you up, did you take any documents with you? Financial documents? Any paperwork from the business? There it was. Something had told him. Not about the trust specifically, perhaps. If he'd known about the trust, he would have asked about it directly. But something had shifted in the landscape of his scheme. Some ripple had reached him, and he was probing the edges to find out where it had come from. I let a small silence pass. Not long. Just a beat. The natural pause of someone trying to remember. I packed my overnight bag, I said. A few personal things. Some photographs. My reading glasses. A sweater. Why? No paperwork? Brandon. I put a faint note of confusion in my voice. The gentle bewilderment of a woman who didn't understand why she was being asked. What would I have packed paperwork for? You said it was going to be a few weeks. Another silence on his end. Longer. Right, he said. Of course, the attorney needed some old records and I couldn't find them at the house. What records? Nothing important. Never mind. He shifted and I could almost hear him recalibrating, deciding whether to push further or pull back. He pulled back. How are you feeling? They treating you okay in there? It's fine, I said. The food could be better. He almost laughed at that. Almost. I'll try to come by next week, he said. That would be nice, I said. I'd like that. We hung up, and I stood at the front desk of Meadow Pines with the receiver in my hand, and I thought about the word attorney, and about which attorney he meant, the one who had drawn up the fraudulent documents, or another one, someone new, someone he'd brought in because things were starting to feel less certain than they had. I went to the activity room where the shared computer terminal sat in the corner between a bookshelf of donated paperbacks and a folding table covered in unfinished jigsaw puzzles. The terminal was supposed to be for resident use, email primarily, and video calls with family. I had used it exactly twice. I sat down and I typed a careful, brief email to Sandra Keel. 3 sentences. The subject line read, "He's looking for something he doesn't know the name of yet." Sandra replied within the hour. 2 words. Good. Ready. Sad. What I did not anticipate, what none of us anticipated, because we were focused on Brandon and on Pinnacle and on the machinery of the legal case assembling itself on the other side of the city, was that the facility itself was about to become part of the story in a way that accelerated everything. It was Walter who brought it to me on a Sunday afternoon, his expression carrying the specific gravity of someone who has confirmed something they hoped they were wrong about. He sat down across from me and he placed a single sheet of paper on the table between us. He had written on it in his careful, precise handwriting, the handwriting of a man trained to make written records that would hold up to scrutiny. I asked a contact to pull the corporate filings for Meadow Pines, he said quietly. The facility's management company, the parent entity that owns the operating license. I looked at the paper, at the name at the top of the corporate structure he'd mapped out. Then I looked up at him. Is that what I think it is? I said. Walter nodded slowly. Pinnacle Estate Management LLC is a subsidiary holding, and the parent entity that owns both Pinnacle and the management company that operates this facility, he tapped the paper, is registered to the same law firm. The same law firm. The one that had drafted the fraudulent POA. The one whose address appeared on Pinnacle's incorporation documents. The one whose name was on the quitclaim deed for my house. We were not just in a facility that had been chosen to isolate me. We were in a facility that was part of the scheme. A facility that had, in all likelihood, received compensation for its role in it. A facility that had processed my intake paperwork knowing exactly what it was being asked to process. I sat with that for a long moment. The television in the corner muttered its game show. June Alderman was doing a crossword puzzle at a nearby table. Harold was asleep in his chair by the window, his 2 canes leaning against the armrest. And I thought about all the people in this building who had no one coming for them. No forensic accountant at the next table. No legal advocate arriving on Thursday mornings. No trust document in a leather folio. No Iris Conley. No Sandra Keel. Just a bed and a call button that nobody answered fast enough in a form they'd signed without reading. I picked up Walter's piece of paper and folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of my cardigan. Walter, I said, call your contact back. I need everything. Every filing, every subsidiary, every name on every document. All of it. He looked at me for a moment with those sharp, quiet eyes. How fast? He said. As fast as they can get it, I said, because this just stopped being about my son. The corporate filing documents Walter's contact pulled came back in 3 batches over 4 days, and each batch was worse than the one before it. The parent entity at the top of the structure was a holding company called Meridian Asset Group, and Meridian's tentacles reached further than any of us had initially understood. It owned the management contract for Meadow Pines. It owned Pinnacle Estate Management, LLC. It had a financial services subsidiary that appeared, based on the filing addresses, to operate out of the same suite of offices as the law firm whose name kept appearing everywhere. And embedded in Meridian's listed partnerships was a name that Walter circled in red pen and slid across the table to me without saying anything. The name was one I recognized, A family attorney who had done routine estate work for Brandon years ago. A man named Gerald Fitch, whom I had met twice, shaken hands with once, and filed away as a minor figure in the background of my son's professional life. Gerald Fitch, it turned out, was not a minor figure. He was the architect. Sandra confirmed it 2 days later. Gerald Fitch had drafted the power of attorney. Gerald Fitch's firm was the registered agent for both Pinnacle and Meridian. Gerald Fitch had, according to what Detective Marsh was now finding in the financial records her investigation had unlocked, received payment from Meridian in the months preceding my placement at Meadow Pines. Payment that was categorized in the filings as consulting fees and was structured in amounts just below the threshold that would trigger automatic reporting requirements. He knew exactly what he was doing, Sandra said, sitting across from me in the nonprofit conference room where we'd been meeting, a room I had come to think of as the war room, which felt slightly dramatic, but also felt accurate. This isn't a lawyer who got pulled into something by a client. This is the person who designed the vehicle. Can he be charged? I asked. That's Pauline's territory. But yes, attorney participation in elder financial exploitation carries its own criminal exposure. And if Fitch drafted instruments he knew were intended to defraud, he's looking at disbarment at minimum. She paused with the particular pause of a litigator who is about to say something precise. What this does for us, civilly, is significant. Fitch's involvement establishes that the power of attorney was drafted with fraudulent intent from the beginning. That's not a document that can be defended. That's a document that gets voided. The word voided sat in the air between us like something physical. The house? I asked. The deed transfer executed under a voided POA has no legal standing. Your house comes back. She looked at her notes. The accounts are more complicated. Money that has already been moved and spent is harder to recover than property that's been transferred on paper. But the accounts Brandon accessed are documented, the amounts are documented, and with a criminal proceeding running parallel to the civil case, there are recovery mechanisms available that don't exist in purely civil litigation. And the trust? The trust was never touched. It's intact, it's protected, and it's going to be the clearest proof that you were never legally or financially incapacitated in the way Brandon needed you to appear. A woman who established a protected charitable trust with that level of structural sophistication is not a woman who needed her son to manage her affairs. She set her pen down. That trust is going to be the most important document in the room, Dad. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday. A civil court proceeding on the emergency motion to void the power of attorney, restore the property deed, and freeze all Pinnacle and Meridian accounts pending the criminal investigation. Pauline Marsh had moved with a speed that surprised even Sandra, and Sandra was not easy to surprise. The parallel criminal investigation had given the civil motion a weight and urgency that pushed it up the docket faster than these things normally moved. Brandon was notified 5 days before the hearing date. He called me the evening of the same day he was notified. I was sitting in my room at Meadow Pines on the edge of the same narrow bed I had sat on for 49 days, and when I picked up the common room phone and heard his voice, I knew immediately that whatever performance of normalcy he had managed to maintain through our previous calls was finished. "What have you done?" he said. Not a question, a statement, flat and hard. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said. "Don't." His voice cracked on the word, just slightly, and that crack contained something I hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Something raw, something that might once have been recognizable as the boy I'd raised, buried now under years of choices I hadn't watched him make carefully enough. "My lawyer called me this morning. There's a court hearing. A PS is involved." "What have you done, Mom?" I held the receiver and I looked at the wall and I let the silence breathe for a moment before I answered. "I protected myself," I said, "the way I should have protected myself from the beginning." "I was helping you. Brandon." My voice was quiet. Not cold, I want to be clear about that because cold would have been easier. It was quiet in the way that things are quiet when they are completely certain. "You took my house. You emptied my accounts. You had a lawyer draw up documents designed to give you legal control of everything I spent my life building. And then you put me in a facility that is owned by the same corporate structure as the company you routed my assets through." I paused. "I know about Meridian. I know about Gerald Fitch. I know about Cassandra's cousin, and I know when Pinnacle was incorporated, and I know what the plan was from the beginning. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Mom, he said finally, and his voice had changed again. The hardness was gone, and what replaced it was something worse, because it sounded almost like the Brandon I remembered, the one who used to call me when things went wrong, the one I had loved without reservation for 50 years. Mom, I can explain. I have a lawyer, I said. Anything you want to say, you can say through her. I hung up. I set the receiver down and I sat in the common room for a very long time, staring at nothing, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired and sad and hollowed out in the particular way that comes from a grief that has been building for weeks, finally being allowed to arrive all at once. I had loved my son. I still loved my son, in whatever complicated, injured way a mother loves a child who has chosen to become someone she doesn't recognize. That love didn't disappear because he had betrayed me. It just changed shape into something that hurt in a completely different way than loss, which was closer to disappointment so deep it had no bottom. But I had said what I needed to say, and I had meant it. Bostul. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the building settle around me. The distant sound of the overnight staff making rounds, the hum of the heating system, someone's television murmuring through a wall. And I thought about my husband. His name was Thomas Hartwell, who had married me when we were both 26 and had no money and no particular plan except each other, who had believed in the business when I first described it to him over a kitchen table covered in notes and said, "Let's do it with a confidence I didn't fully feel myself," who had died at 68 of a heart attack that announced itself on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning whatsoever and left me standing in a hospital corridor trying to understand how a world that had contained Thomas for 68 years was going to function without him. I thought about what he would have said if he'd known what Brandon had done. And I found, lying in that narrow bed, that I couldn't quite imagine it. Not because Thomas had been soft, but because the scenario was so far outside anything he would have allowed that his imagination and mine had never had reason to prepare for it. Thomas had trusted Brandon. We had both trusted him. The difference was that Thomas wasn't here to have that trust broken, and I was. I got up at 5 in the morning, and I showered, and I dressed in the clothes Sandra had arranged to have brought for me. A dark gray suit, well-fitted, the kind I used to wear to business meetings when I needed people to take me seriously before I had said a single word. I sat in my room and I read through the trust document one more time, all 34 pages, and then I put it back in the leather folio and held it in my lap and waited for morning. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Courtrooms on television are grand and high-ceilinged and staged for drama, but this was a civil proceeding in a mid-sized courthouse, and the room had the slightly worn, fluorescent-lit quality of a place that processes a great deal of difficult human business without any particular fanfare. Brandon was already there when I came in, sitting at the opposite table with Gerald Fitch beside him, or rather, with the attorney Gerald Fitch had hired to represent him, now that Fitch himself was the subject of scrutiny. Fitch was not present. He had retained his own counsel 2 days prior, which Sandra had told me was the clearest possible indication of how he was reading the situation. Brandon looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was good. He had always dressed well, my son. He'd inherited Thomas's instinct for presentation, but there was something disheveled beneath the surface of it, a tightness around his eyes and jaw that no amount of good tailoring could smooth over. He looked at me when I came in. I looked back at him. I held his gaze for 3 seconds exactly, long enough to be deliberate, and then I turned to Sandra and sat down. Walter was in the gallery, second row, with his 2 canes hooked over the seat beside him. Noel was there. Renata Stitch was there, not as press. The proceedings were civil, not open to media coverage, but as a private observer, because she had a stake in what happened in this room. Harold was there, slower than usual, moving carefully, but there. June Alderman had come. She had dressed in a blue wool coat that she told me afterward she'd bought the year she retired, that she'd been saving for an occasion that felt worthy of it. She sat in the back row and held her purse in her lap with both hands and watched everything with the clear, steady attention of a woman who had spent 31 years making sure young people understood that what happened in her room mattered. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Catherine Doss, who had the brisk, no-nonsense efficiency of someone who reads the briefs and comes prepared. She had read the briefs. That was evident from the first minute. The proceeding began. I will not walk you through every legal argument, because the law is complex and the arguments were detailed, and Sandra presented them with a precision that I could follow but would not do justice to in the retelling. What I will tell you is the shape of it, the emotional architecture of those hours, because that is what I remember most clearly. Brandon's attorney argued that the power of attorney was legitimately executed, that Brandon had acted in good faith to protect his mother's financial interests, and that the connections to Pinnacle and Meridian were a matter of business relationships rather than fraudulent design. He used the phrase good faith 11 times. I counted. Sandra presented the corporate structure documents Walter's contact had compiled. She presented the timeline establishing that Pinnacle had been incorporated 14 months before my placement at Meadow Pines. She presented the evidence of Gerald Fitch's payments from Meridian. She presented the statements Noel had gathered from June, Harold, and 2 other residents regarding their own experiences with financial pressure at the facility. And then she said, Your Honor, I would like to introduce into evidence a document that speaks directly to the fraudulent nature of the power of attorney executed by the respondent. She presented the trust. She walked Judge Doss through its structure, its protections, and most critically, its creation date, executed years before any of the POA or estate planning documents Brandon had filed, establishing a clear prior legal framework for the management of my assets that directly contradicted the premise that I was financially incapacitated or in need of his intervention. This trust, Sandra said, was created by Evelyn Hartwell at the height of her business career, with the specific foresight to protect her assets against exactly this kind of unauthorized takeover. It requires her direct, in-person, witnessed authorization for any modification. No such authorization was ever given. No attempt to obtain such authorization was ever made, because the respondent did not know the trust existed. She paused. And the reason he didn't know it existed is that Mrs. Hartwell, in 22 years of building and running a business, learned to protect herself. The respondent's entire scheme was built on the assumption that his mother was a passive figure whose assets could be controlled without her knowledge. This document, she held it up, is the proof that he never understood who she actually was. The room was quiet. I looked at my hands in my lap. I thought about the kitchen table where Thomas and I had first talked about the business. I thought about the first quarterly report I had ever filed, sitting on the floor of our spare bedroom at midnight with a calculator and a cup of cold coffee, trying to make the numbers work. I thought about every meeting where someone had underestimated me and paid for it later. I thought about a parking lot in December and a stack of papers I had signed because I loved my son and believed he loved me back. I looked up. Brandon was staring at the trust document in Sandra's hand with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not in 50 years of knowing him, not through any argument or disappointment or failure. It was the expression of someone watching something they were certain they had accounted for turn out to be something they had missed entirely. It was the expression of a man who had built a house of cards and had just discovered that the table it was sitting on belonged to someone else. His attorney leaned over and said something in his ear. Brandon didn't respond. He was still staring. Judge Doss asked several pointed questions. Sandra answered them. Brandon's attorney attempted a rebuttal that became increasingly strained as the judge pressed on the timeline and the corporate connections and the specific language of the POA documents. At one point, the judge said, with the dry precision of someone who has stopped trying to be diplomatic, "Counsel, are you suggesting that this elaborate corporate structure connecting the management company, the financial holding firm, and the residential facility was coincidental to your client's decision to place his mother in that specific facility?" Brandon's attorney said they would need more time to establish the full context of the business relationships. Judge Doss looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her documents. Then she said, "I've seen enough to rule on the emergency motion." Quote. She voided the power of attorney. She voided it on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, citing the absence of independent legal counsel, The circumstances of execution outside standard intake procedures, and the documented connection between the executing attorney and the entities positioned to benefit from the POA's existence. She ordered a freeze on all Pinnacle and Meridian accounts, pending the criminal investigation. She referred the matter of Gerald Fitch's participation to the State Bar's disciplinary board, and she ordered that the property deed transfer, my house, be reversed, and the title restored to my name, pending a full accounting of all assets moved under the authority of the voided document. She said all of this in the measured, procedural language of civil court rulings, and each sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a height. When it was over, I sat for a moment without moving. Sandra put her hand on my arm, briefly, and I nodded, and she understood that I needed a moment and gave it to me. Across the room, Brandon's attorney was speaking quietly to him, very quietly, with the controlled expression of a professional delivering information to a client who needs to understand that the landscape has fundamentally changed. Brandon was listening with his head slightly bowed. His hands were flat on the table. He looked up once, just once. And he looked at me across the room, and I looked back at him. And I did not feel what I thought I would feel. I had expected something resolving, something final, the clean click of a mechanism completing its cycle. What I actually felt was more complicated and more human than that. A sorrow that had nothing to do with regret about what I had done, and everything to do with mourning what had been lost between us, which was something that no court ruling was ever going to restore. My son had chosen this. I had to keep reminding myself of that. He had chosen it deliberately, with planning and preparation, and the fact that I still grieved it was not weakness. It was just the truth of what it meant to have loved him for 50 years. I stood up. I picked up the leather folio with the trust document inside it. I walked toward the gallery where Walter was getting to his feet with his canes, and Noelle was gathering her overstuffed bag, and Harold was saying something to June that made her smile, small and tired and genuine. Renata Stitch met my eyes from the back row and gave me a single nod. I nodded back. In the hallway outside the courtroom, while the building moved around us with its ordinary business, Sandra stood beside me and said, "That's the beginning. The criminal investigation runs separately, and the asset recovery will take time. But the foundation is established. What he built is coming down." "I know," I said. "Are you all right?" I thought about it. Honestly. "I've been better," I said, "but I've also been much worse. Somewhere around day 11 in that facility, I was considerably worse than this." She almost smiled. "What do you want to do now?" I looked down the courthouse hallway at the light coming through the tall windows at the far end, and I thought about a narrow bed in a parking lot view room, and about June's blue wool coat, and about Harold's 2 canes, and about all the people still inside that building who didn't have what I had. The records, the contacts, the years of knowing how systems worked and where they could be made to bend. "I want to go back to Meadow Pines," I said. Sandra looked at me. "You don't have to. We can arrange—" "I know I don't have to," I said. "I want to. There are people in that building who are not done yet, and I'm not done either." I walked toward the light at the end of the hallway, and behind me I heard Walter's canes on the tile floor and Noelle's voice saying something to Harold, and the small, steady sounds of people who had chosen to stand up, moving forward together through an ordinary Thursday morning that had turned out to be anything but. The drive back to Meadow Pines that afternoon was quiet. Sandra had offered to arrange a hotel, a friend's guest room, anything other than returning to the facility, and I had declined all of it. Walter rode with me in the car Noelle had arranged, and he didn't say much, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate most about him. He understood that some moments didn't need to be filled with words, that sometimes the most respectful thing one person can offer another is simply their presence without the pressure of conversation. I watched the city move past the window, and I thought about the shape of what had just happened, turning it over the way you turn over something you've found to check whether it's what it appears to be. The POA voided. The deed reversed. The accounts frozen. Fitch referred to the bar. The criminal investigation still running, still building, still assembling the full weight of what Brandon and Cassandra and Derek Folau and the entire Meridian structure had constructed, and what it had cost the people it had been constructed against. It wasn't over. Sandra had been clear about that, and I appreciated her for not pretending otherwise. Asset recovery was a long road. Criminal proceedings moved at their own pace. The full unwinding of what Meridian had built, the facility contracts, the subsidiary structures, the pattern of placements and financial redirections that likely extended far beyond my own case, that was the work of investigators and prosecutors and regulators who would be at it for months, possibly years. But the foundation, as Sandra had said, was established. What he built was coming down. When I walked back through the doors of Meadow Pines that evening, Patrice was at the front desk, and the expression on her face when she saw me, the small, involuntary flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed over by professional composure, told me that word had already reached the facility's administration. Of course it had. The account freeze would have hit Meridian's operational accounts, which meant the management company that ran Meadow Pines was already feeling the financial pressure of the investigation. And the people at the top of that management company were making calls and sending emails and trying to understand exactly how much damage was coming their way. Patrice said, "Mrs. Hartwell, we weren't expecting you back this evening." "I live here," I said pleasantly, and walked past her toward the elevator. In the common room, Harold was awake in his chair. He had come back before me, moving slowly but with the particular energy of someone who has witnessed something significant and is still processing it. June was there too, still in her blue wool coat, not yet ready to put it away. When she saw me, she stood up, and I shook my head slightly because I didn't want to fuss, and she sat back down and just looked at me with those steady, clear eyes and said, "Well?" "It went the way it needed to go," I said. She nodded once. That was enough. 3 days after the hearing, 2 investigators from the state's Elder Care Regulatory Division arrived at Meadow Pines unannounced. I know this because I was in the hallway near the administrative offices when they came through the front doors. 2 women in dark coats with identification and the purposeful energy of people on a timed task. And I watched them present credentials to a very pale Patrice and be escorted toward the back offices where the facility's management records were kept. The investigation of Meadow Pines itself had been formally opened, and Renata Stitch's story, which ran in a regional publication 4 days after the hearing, carefully timed to coincide with the regulatory filing, had named the facility, named Meridian, and quoted 3 residents on record, including Harold, whose 40 years of labor organizing had given him a relationship with the microphone that I found genuinely admirable. He had said, in the piece, "I have been in rooms where people with power tried to tell me that the workers didn't know what was happening to them. They were wrong then, they're wrong now. We know exactly what's happening to us." It was the most widely shared line from the story. The administration of Meadow Pines did not collapse overnight. These things never do. And I was under no illusion that institutional accountability moved as fast as individual accountability. But it began to move. The regulatory investigators stayed for 2 full days. A second visit was scheduled. The management company's contract with the facility was placed under review. And Patrice, I noticed, had stopped calling residents sweetheart. Small things. But small things are how large things begin. The criminal charges came 6 weeks after the hearing. Sandra called me at 8 in the morning, and I was sitting at the small table in my room with a cup of tea that was actually decent. Noelle had brought me a box of proper tea bags on her last visit, an act of kindness so specific and practical that it had moved me more than she probably knew. And I answered, and she said, "Brandon has been charged. Cassandra and Derek Falau as well. Gerald Fitch is being charged separately, and the bar has suspended his license pending the disciplinary proceeding." I set the tea down. "What are the charges?" I asked. She listed them. Elder financial exploitation, fraud, conspiracy, unauthorized practice. That one was for Fitch, specifically related to the nature of the instruments he drafted. She said the charges were solid, that the corporate documentation and the financial trail and the timeline evidence had given the prosecution a structured case rather than a circumstantial one. She said there would likely be plea negotiations before it went to trial, because the evidence was heavy enough that taking it to trial carried significant risk for all the defendants. "Will there be restitution?" I asked. "That's part of what will be negotiated. The frozen accounts, Whatever is recoverable from Pinnacle and Meridian, yes. The spent funds are harder, but Brandon and Cassandra's personal assets are on the table, and Fitch has malpractice exposure that his firm's insurance will likely settle rather than litigate. She paused. It won't be everything, Evelyn. I want to be honest with you about that. Some of what was moved has been spent or further transferred, and recovery will be partial. But the trust is intact, the property is restored, and the majority of the liquid assets that were frozen will come back. Okay, I said. Okay? She sounded slightly surprised. Sandra, I said, I ran a business for 22 years. I know that complete recovery is a fairy tale. I'll take the realistic version. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're a remarkable woman. I'm a practical one, I said. There's a difference, Mom. I went home on a Wednesday, 7 weeks after the hearing, 58 days after Brandon had driven me to Meadow Pines and left me there. Sandra's paralegal drove me. We pulled up in front of the house, my house, with its garden that had gone somewhat ragged in the winter cold and its front walk that needed sweeping and its plain, familiar face that I had looked at for 31 years. And I sat in the passenger seat for a moment before I got out. The key was the same key. Sandra had arranged that. I stood on the front walk and I put the key in the lock and I turned it and pushed the door open, and the smell of the house came out to meet me. That specific, irreplaceable smell of a place where you have lived long enough that it has absorbed you, your history, the accumulation of all the ordinary days. And I stood in the doorway and I breathed it in, and I did not try to stop the tears that came, because I had earned them and they were mine. The house had been gone through. I could see it, the subtle wrongness of drawers not quite closed, of items not quite where I had left them. Files had been searched, cabinets had been opened. The small desk in the study where I kept records had been gone through, though nothing had been taken that Sandra's team couldn't document and account for. Thomas's study was untouched. They hadn't gone in there, or if they had found nothing of value and left it as they found it. I stood in the doorway of that room for a long time, looking at his books and his chair and the photograph of the two of us on our 25th anniversary that sat on the corner of his desk, and I talked to him the way I had been talking to him since he died. Not out loud, not in words exactly, but in the way you carry someone with you and consult them internally, the running conversation that doesn't end just because one person is no longer physically present. I'm back, I told him. It took longer than it should have, but I'm back. The weeks that followed were not simple or easy or clean in the way that stories sometimes become clean at their endings. I want to be honest about that because dishonesty would disrespect everything it actually took to get there. The recovery of the liquid assets was partial, as Sandra had predicted. Roughly 70% of what had been moved, which was better than I had allowed myself to hope for, and still represented a real loss that I had to adjust to. The property was fully restored. The trust was intact. The total picture was survivable, and more than survivable. It was enough to do what I had decided to do. The plea agreement, when it came, involved Brandon pleading guilty to elder financial exploitation and conspiracy, with a sentence that included mandatory restitution payments, 3 years of probation, and community service requirements. Cassandra pled to conspiracy. Derek Follow received the harshest sentence of the three because his prior complaint history and his central role in the financial mechanics of the scheme placed him firmly in the category of someone who had done this before and intended to keep doing it. Gerald Fitch was disbarred. He was also convicted on fraud and conspiracy charges. He received a sentence that Sandra described as appropriate and I described as insufficient, because there is no sentence that adequately addresses designing a system for stealing from vulnerable elderly people and running it as a business model. But he would not be practicing law again. That much was permanent. Brandon, my son. I have thought a great deal about what to tell you about Brandon and how to tell it, because he is the part of this story that refuses to resolve into something simple. And I think that's right. I think it should refuse. He served his probation. He paid what he was ordered to pay in restitution, monthly, in amounts that I know represented a genuine financial hardship to him, because Cassandra had left when the legal situation became undeniable, and the life he had built on the expectation of my money collapsed along with the scheme itself. I did not see him during this period. He did not attempt to contact me, and I did not attempt to contact him, and that silence was the right call for both of us. What I felt about my son, what I still feel, is not something I can package neatly. It is grief and anger and a permanent kind of sadness, and something underneath all of that which is stubbornly love, the love you feel for a person you have watched grow from nothing and who chose, at some point that I will never fully understand, to become someone capable of what he did. I don't excuse it. I will never excuse it. But I also don't pretend that the love evaporated, because it didn't, and pretending it did would be the last lie I told on his behalf, and I was done telling lies on his behalf. I set a boundary. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just quietly and permanently. He would not be part of my life unless he could demonstrate, over a very long period of time, that the person capable of what he had done was not the person he intended to continue being. Whether he ever would, I didn't know. That was his work to do, not mine. My work was different. The idea for what to do with Meadow Pines came from Walter, characteristically, delivered over dinner one evening as a passing observation rather than a proposal. The facility is going to lose its management contract, he said, pushing his food around his plate in the way he did when the kitchen was having a particularly uninspired evening. When Meridian's contract is terminated, the operating license reverts to the property owner. The property owner is a separate entity, a real estate holding company that appears to have been a mostly passive investor in the Meridian structure. Meaning they may be motivated to find new management quickly, I said. Motivated and vulnerable to a sufficiently organized alternative, he said. I looked at him. He looked at me. You have the trust, he said. It's a charitable trust, properly structured. It could fund a management transition and an operational renovation. It would take legal work to align the charitable purpose, but Iris Conley helped you build it. She could help you reshape it. You want me to buy a nursing home, I said. I want you to consider it, he said. I'm not suggesting you run it yourself. I'm suggesting that the people best positioned to know what this place should be are the people who have been living in what it currently is. I thought about June in her blue wool coat. I thought about Harold and his 2 canes, and his 40 years of labor organizing, and his voice like gravel that had spoken on record to Renata Stitch's story and made people pay attention. I thought about Dara, the young aide who had looked up Pinnacle's name on her phone for me without thinking twice, who was overworked and underpaid and still showing up because she cared about the people in this building, even when the system around her didn't. What would you do? I asked Walter. If it happened, what would you actually do? He considered it. Consult, he said, on the financial oversight structure, pro bono. He paused. I have time. You have time, I said. We both have time, he said. And then he added, with the dry precision that was one of his most characteristic qualities, considerably more time than anyone in this building gave us credit for. It took 8 months. It was not simple, and it was not cheap, and there were legal complications and regulatory hurdles and moments when Iris Conley called me to walk through some new obstacle in the structure, and I sat on the phone and thought about whether I was being foolish, whether this was more than one person should attempt, whether the practical thing was to take the recovered assets and the restored property and the intact trust and simply go home and tend my garden and let the rest of it be someone else's problem. I always came back to the same answer. The same answer I had come back to every morning at Meadow Pines when the weight of what had happened settled onto me before I was fully awake, and I had to decide again whether to get up. I got up. The renovation took 4 months after the management transition was finalized. I did not gut the building or transform it into something unrecognizable. That kind of dramatic overhaul makes for a better story, but a worse result. And I had learned over 22 years in business that sustainable change is specific and incremental, and pays attention to what is actually broken rather than replacing everything and hoping for the best. What was actually broken? The staffing ratios, which we corrected with funding that allowed the facility to hire properly and pay decently. The medication management system, which we digitized and made auditable. The call response tracking, which we moved to a verified electronic system that could not be falsified. The room assignment process, which we made resident-directed and transparent. The financial oversight for residents without family advocates, which we formalized through a volunteer program that Noel's nonprofit agreed to staff and train. The common room got better furniture and better light. The kitchen got a consultant who actually cared about institutional food and understood that feeding elderly people well was not a luxury. The garden in the back courtyard, which had been a patch of gravel and dead grass since at least the previous decade, got rebuilt, with raised beds designed for accessibility, because Harold had mentioned once that he used to grow tomatoes, and I had not forgotten it. Harold grew tomatoes. They were not, he reported, as good as the ones he grew in his old garden. But they were good enough, and he ate them at dinner with the quiet satisfaction of someone reclaiming something small and important that had been taken from them. June Alderman moved into the corner room with 2 windows. Nobody moved her without her permission again. Dara was offered a senior aide position. She took it, and she cried a little when I told her. And then she looked embarrassed about the crying, and I told her there was nothing to be embarrassed about, that caring about your work was not a weakness, that in my experience, it was the only way any work ever got done properly. Walter moved into a room on the 3rd floor with a view of the street and set up what he called his consulting office in a corner of it with a proper desk and a lamp and a bookshelf that he filled with files and professional journals and a framed photograph of his wife that he put in the center of the top shelf where he could see it from anywhere in the room. I did not move in. I went home, to my house, to my garden, to Thomas's study and his chair, and the photograph of the 2 of us at 25 years. I went home and I slept in my own bed, and I made coffee in my own kitchen in the morning, and I walked through my neighborhood in the early light, and I let myself be ordinary, which was its own kind of restoration. But I came to the facility 3 days a week. I had a small office there, nothing grand, a desk and 2 chairs and a window overlooking the rebuilt courtyard. And I sat in it and I did the work that the work required. And on Thursdays I had lunch with Walter and we talked about the financial reports and the staffing numbers and whatever operational issue needed attention. And sometimes we talked about other things entirely, about his wife and about Thomas and about what it meant to have built a life and to still be building it at 72. I want to tell you something now, directly, because we have been together through this whole story and you have earned the honesty of it. I was a woman who loved her son so completely that she handed him the tools of her own destruction and called it trust. I have spent a great deal of time since then asking myself where I went wrong, not in the legal or financial sense, but in the human sense, in the sense of how a mother raises a child and what she teaches him about the world, and about what he is owed by it. I don't have a clean answer. I don't think clean answers exist for questions like that. What I think is this: I gave Brandon everything I could give him, and somewhere in the giving, I failed to teach him that the giving was not owed, that love is not a transaction, that the people who love you are not a resource to be managed, that the measure of who you are is not what you can accumulate, but what you are willing to do and what you are willing to refuse to do. I failed to teach him that, or he failed to learn it. I am no longer certain where the line is between those 2 things, and I have made a certain peace with not being certain. What I know is what I would tell you now, whoever you are, wherever you are watching from, whatever version of this story you recognize from your own life. Your money is yours. Your house is yours. Your name is yours. The assets you have built through decades of your own labor belong to you, and the love you feel for the people in your family does not obligate you to hand those things over without understanding what you are signing, without independent counsel, without the time to think and the space to ask questions. Love and legal authority are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. Anyone who tells you otherwise, or anyone who uses your love as a mechanism for obtaining your signature, is not acting from love. They're acting from calculation. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to ask questions. You're allowed to have a lawyer review something before you sign it, even if the person handing it to you is your own child. Especially if the person handing it to you is your own child. The people who love you will not be offended by your caution. The people who are offended by your caution are telling you something important. I am 73 years old, and I have made my share of mistakes. In business, in motherhood, in the years I spent being too patient with behavior that deserved less patience. I am not a cautionary tale, and I am not a triumph. I am a person who went through something very hard and came out the other side still standing, still working, still showing up 3 days a week to a place that I am making better because I know from the inside how much worse it was. I am also, most mornings, happy. Not in the uncomplicated way you are happy when nothing has ever hurt you, but in the way you are happy when you know exactly what you have survived and what you have built from the surviving. That is, in my experience, a more durable kind of happiness. It has better bones. The last time I walked through the doors of Meadow Pines on a regular working day, I passed the front desk, where a new receptionist, a young man named Cato, who was earnest and slightly nervous and genuinely kind, greeted residents and visitors by their names without calling anyone sweetheart. And I walked down the main hallway and I looked at the bulletin board by the elevator. Someone had taken down the poster with the mountain landscape and the inspirational quote that nobody ever read. In its place was a simple corkboard covered in photographs. Residents' photographs, personal ones, brought from the rooms where they lived. Gardens and grandchildren and wedding pictures and fishing trips and diplomas and birthday cakes and all the dense, specific, irreplaceable evidence of lives fully lived. I stood in front of that board for a long moment. Walter came up beside me, moving slowly with his canes, and looked at it too. "June's idea," he said. "Of course it was," I said. We stood there together for a while, the two of us, looking at all the photographs of all those lives, and the hallway moved around us with its ordinary business. Dara passing with a cart, Cato answering the phone, someone laughing in the common room. And I thought about Thomas, and about the 22 years of the business, and about a parking lot in December and a stack of papers I should never have signed, and about everything that had happened between that moment and this one. And then I straightened my shoulders, and I walked down the hall to my office, and I sat down at my desk, and I got to work. Because that is what you do. You get to work, and you do not stop.